Those of you who don't know me, I'm John Hushin. After I retired, I went back and did a Master of Divinity and became a specialist in first century Judeo-Christian history and sacred scripture. And I've given a few of these talks here at Trinity. Never given this one before, however. This was inspired by the fact that earlier, actually starting about 3 or 4 years ago, I started writing a novel, which was published in the spring. And then the publisher asked me to follow it up with another novel, which should come out within the next week or two, depending upon when the Library of Congress decides to assign a number to it, because it can't be marketed until it has that number on it. And I've been waiting now for 4 weeks. The novel's ready to go and ready to have that number inserted, and it'll go on. But in the course of writing these novels, I had occasion to review how Christians came to be Christians in the 1st and 2nd century. And I realize, of course, that many of us who have been Christians all of our lives, perhaps even in this location for many, many years, come to think of this as being the way it always has been. And of course, that's not true. There were a lot of conflicting ideas floating around the Eastern Roman Empire during the 1st and 2nd centuries. And it took hundreds of years before those ideas solidified. And in fact, the first full statement of our creed occurred in the 4th century after the Council of Nicaea. Most people think that the Nicene Creed actually emerged from the Council of Nicaea at the beginning of the 4th century. It turned out that that wasn't true. It took 6 more councils spread over 300 years before the Council of Constantinople finally promulgated the Nicene Creed in the 6th century. And so for many, many years, Christians thought about God and about Jesus in very different ways. So I'm going to try to develop some of those ideas. The notes you have before you are not just for this week. It's for the whole series. So don't be concerned. I'm not going to try to get through all of those pages today. When I talked about this course with Father Nicholas, he reminded me that I needed to make 2 cautions. One is the fact that many of the ideas that I'm going to express to you in the next few weeks were ultimately rejected by the church and did not become part of the creed. And even today, some of the decisions that were made by those first councils are being questioned. And the mere fact that we have multiple Christian denominations in the world today strongly suggests that we haven't resolved all of these issues even today. And so I need to remind you that some of these comments that I will make are very tentative, and also suggest to you that you need to be vigilant, that you just don't take everything that I say as being the way it absolutely was. So I'm going to try to set the stage for you, and we're talking now about a period that was roughly a generation or 2 after the resurrection. We're dealing with a period toward the end of the 1st century in the Eastern Mediterranean. Jesus has died, as I said, at least a generation ago, and stories are being told in our families and in our compounds and in our towns about his life. And as of a few years ago, What had been the center of most of our lives, the temple in Jerusalem, was destroyed by perhaps a mistaken order, an order that was perhaps misinterpreted by the grandson of the man who ultimately became the emperor of Rome. And after a 2-year siege of the Temple Mount by rebels, does this sound familiar? I mean, we're talking about the 21st century. After a 2-year siege of the Temple Mount by rebels, the Roman army essentially moved in and destroyed the entire Temple Mount, leaving not a stone on top of another stone. This had been the center of Second Temple Judaism for over 500 years and was an essential feature of Judaism. During the period prior to the destruction of the temple, and for the next 50 years when rebel bands continued to prey on Jerusalem, until about 120, 125, something in that period, many Jews left Israel. Certainly they left Jerusalem, or they were exiled. They were thrown out. And they moved to a number of the other prominent cities in the empire, including, of course, Rome, Antioch, Ephesus, Alexandria in Egypt, near Cairo, and points east and west. In each of those cities, the Jews were in a minority, and therefore they were being tolerated at sufferance for the most part. They mostly lived together in like-minded communities that we would call ghettos today, typically just outside the walls of these Roman cities, often in squalor, in places without paved roads, without plumbing, without fresh water, etc. There was almost no communication among these various places, and so each of them began to grow up within itself. And we began to see almost immediately two fairly significant groups of Christian ideas getting together in various places. Let me explain that. Essentially, there were, at the very beginning, discussions among Christians as to whether or not you had to be a good Jew, a righteous Jew, to be a good Christian. And most of us are familiar with the letters of Paul, and some of us may be familiar with the passages from the Acts of the Apostles, which describe a decision that was purportedly made in Jerusalem by the so-called pillars of the church, the three apostles, James, John, and Peter, apparently who were then leaders of the Christian community in Jerusalem. But those three, after taking advice from the community in Jerusalem, at a meeting which is now being referred to as the Jerusalem Council, although I doubt it was called that at the time, decided in favor of Paul. Essentially, that you did not have to be a Jew to be a Christian. This immediately caused the first schism in Christianity, because some Christians who were devout Jews simply could not accept that idea. And so we saw the first split in Christian ideas over this subject. The two leading places where the notion that you had to be a good Jew to be a good Christian were Antioch and Rome. And curiously, we now believe that the Gospel of Matthew which is often referred to by scholars as the gospel for or to the Jews, was of course written in Antioch, where it was necessary to be a righteous Jew, to be a good Christian. And of course, if you read Matthew's gospel carefully, you will see that he is extraordinarily sympathetic to notions of Jewish righteousness, the Jewish holy days, etc. And he sees the message of Jesus as being a reformed message, a message that reformed Judaism, rather than a message that formed a new religion. Those ideas became, I don't think this is moving. No, it's not. I didn't touch it. Can you hear me?
Forward about 6 feet. Use that whole podium. That'll push you closer to us.
Okay. Well, they're filming this, so I'm not supposed to move. And so we have basically large groups of Christians living in Antioch and Rome who essentially consider themselves to be Jewish Christians. It is quite obvious, however, that that wasn't universally the case. And of course, most of the churches that Paul founded in Turkey, to the east, and in the Balkans, and it turns out also that the church in Alexandria, all became churches which tended to disdain Judaism and throw out Judaic concepts as being fundamental to Christianity. And so here we have, by the end of the first century, a massive distinction between two kinds of Christians. Of course, at that time, there was no ability to enforce any kind of orthodoxy, sameness, or unity. I know, having been raised in parochial schools, that the Roman Church teaches that the papacy started with Peter in about 50, and that it was unbroken until the present time, and that there was therefore an orthodoxy from that period. We now know that Peter was the Bishop of Rome, not the Pope. And as such, he had authority over the Christians who chose to attend his church in Trastevere, just outside of Rome, across the Tiber from the capital city of Rome. And he had very little authority beyond that. It was literally hundreds of years before the bishops of Christianity began to form together in council and began to attempt to enforce some sort of orthodoxy. And so there was no methodology for enforcing that orthodoxy. Now that was the people of the time would not have considered that to be unusual. When we talk today about Judaism and the notion of the high priest, most people almost automatically conclude that of course the high priest had authority over Judaism and could enforce the Mosaic Code and the rules that are contained in the first 5 books of the Jewish Bible, the Torah. That was not the case. The high priest had authority within the Temple Mount and not beyond it. And he did not take decisions on doctrinal matters. And so the Christians who were in diaspora, or whose parents had been involved in Judaism in Jerusalem, wouldn't have found it very unusual to discover that there was no central authority to decide any of these issues. And in fact, the typical way that issues were resolved was something that we see even today in Judaism. And that is, rabbis would gather, or teachers would gather groups of men around them, typically anywhere from 12 given the Roman Empire's strength and its pervasiveness throughout this period, that there would have been a central authority, perhaps appointed by the emperor, who would have resolved all of these issues. That didn't happen for another 300 years. And therefore, we were really open to lots of different ideas. When you consider that the world was essentially a diverse place in terms of thought, the Christian world was a very diverse place in terms of its thought. And put that together with the fact that we have very little communication among our cities. And finally, that given the charge of Jesus to his disciples in all 4 of the Gospels, we are an evangelical people. And an evangelical people means that we want everybody else to believe the way we believe. And we're prepared to attempt to make that come true. That is a situation, you can probably imagine, which caused a great deal of conflict within the Christian communities. And we find today, for example, that in the principal cities of early Christianity, there were multiple churches, house churches, and later basilicas. Basilicas, or churches as we know churches today, really didn't come into existence until toward the end of the 2nd century. Prior to that, most meetings like this would have taken place in a large home, and the leader of the meeting would have typically been the owner of the house, and they would have been basically a host or a hostess of the meeting, and that's how the meetings would have taken place. But at any rate, we find that in the principal places of Christianity, there were communities of like thinkers. And it's remarkably modern when we think about it, when we look around Naples and we see the number of Christian communities that fill the streets of this town, with each slightly different views as to what the rules and regulations and how Scripture should be read. Toward the end of the 1st century, of course, we began to have written versions of the Gospels. Over the course of the last 20 or 30 years, the biblical scholars have been slowly moving forward the dates in which the Gospels were originally written. When I went to school only 20 years ago, the standard belief was that Mark's Gospel was written around between 45 and 50. Paul's letters were written between 50 and 67. Matthew and Luke appeared around 60, 65, maybe a little bit later, maybe as late as 70. And then John around 80. Well, most biblical scholars today will tell us that Mark probably didn't appear until about 55 or 60, probably simultaneously with the letters of Paul. And in fact, the first letter of Paul to the Thessalonians south and the north. Same God, but different names. That this man, selected by God, would save the Jews. There were long debates within the Jewish community as to what saving meant. We, of course, in modern times, have mostly taken saving to mean that they would be rescued from the domination of the Roman Empire. The people who had occupied Palestine for many years. Incidentally, the Romans weren't first to occupy Palestine. By the time the Roman Empire occupied Palestine, the land of Judah had been occupied for more than 500 years by the Macedonians under Alexander, by the Greeks, and finally the Romans. And so it was not a new concept that they were living under the domination of a foreign leader or emperor. And so we had the concept of the Messiah who would either liberate Israel from the Roman Empire, or maybe, and some of the more modern Judaic scholars are now suggesting, that the Messiah would liberate the Jews from sin and evil and bring them to salvation, rather than bringing them a positive freedom from domination from a foreign power. So we had the notion of Messiah. And then from the book of Daniel, which appeared probably in the 2nd century BC, we had the notion of, we've heard this word before, the Son of Man. Strange word. Okay? In Hebrew, it literally means Son of Man. We've taken it we've given that name to Jesus, and in the Gospels. But to the Jews, the Son of Man was a different character entirely. The Son of Man was a person who was persecuted on earth and was ultimately destroyed for the sin of humankind. Incidentally, although he did not use the word Son of Man, the reading you heard this morning from the prophet Isaiah is describing the Son of Man. It's that kind of a person we're talking about. But this person, after he suffers and dies, then goes and he judges humankind. He becomes the supreme judge of humankind. And Christians have blended this notion of Son of God and Son of Man. And you've probably heard the stories of the Last Judgment when all of us will need to explain our lives on earth. Well, that was the Son of Man notion that the Christians brought into their testament. And then the third concept was the notion of Son of God. That is perhaps the most curious of the three. Because to a Jew, if you describe someone as the Son of God, you were describing a righteous Jew. Not literally the Son of God, but someone who was attempting to follow all of the rules of the Torah and to live a good life in conformity with the Torah. And so when the Christians who had followed Jesus, and incidentally who were then being referred to as the followers, not the Christians, the notion of Christian probably emerged in the 70s in Antioch. Before that, they were called the followers of the turned away from Christianity in Harlem. And they saw the issue of Son of God as essentially a fundamental violation of notions of monotheism. That there could not be two gods. There could not be a God the Father and a God the Son. Because that would be two gods, and that violates the very, very notions of Judaism dating back to Abraham, Isaac, Joseph, and Moses. And so there are probably about 20 or 25 books floating around our libraries these days. And most of them have a title similar to Many Christianities. Some of them have been very, very popular and have sold extraordinarily well. Essentially, the thesis of those novels, or those books, I'm sorry, they're not novels, they're books. The essential thesis of those books is that during the first 2 centuries or so of Christianity, at least, there were many forms of Christianity. And that the Christianity we know today grew out of those various different ideas. We may be aware, of course, most of us I think are, that Christianity became became a tolerated religion, and then the institutionalized religion of the Roman Empire, only in the 4th century. And so everything I'm going to be talking about over the course of the next couple of weeks describes some of the ideas that were floating around during that period. Where do these ideas come from? How do we get the ideas that form our belief systems and ultimately result in the creeds of our churches? Of course, we all have heard the word revelation. And we've heard many, many times and over again that the Holy Bible, both the Christian Bible and the Jewish Bible or Old Testament, were revealed. They are the revelation of God. And then we have to ask ourselves, how do we know what has been revealed by God? Because as far as we know, virtually all revelation was filtered through human minds and human hands when it was written down. Now, some, of course, have the notion of an angel, a messenger of God, standing in a room, or perhaps speaking from the rafters, and dictating to someone who prepares the written materials that ultimately resulted in our Bibles. I think most biblical scholars today would argue that the notion of dictation is probably a fiction, but nevertheless, we still can believe with varying degrees of accuracy that the words that we read today in the Bible were in fact inspired by the Holy Spirit and were more or less accurately transcribed in the books that we have. And so Revelation is certainly one way that we learn ideas and begin to form belief systems. A second technique is authority. We saw this in the early Christian world. Most of the early Christians became Christians as a result of what we refer to today as top-down Christianity or top-down authority. If the Lord of the manor became a Christian, then everyone who worked in the manor became a Christian. If a general worshipped a certain Roman god, then the entire military group working under his authority worshipped the same God. There's no question whatsoever that authority played a significant role in the development of religion and certainly in the development of early Christianity. A third source of belief is something we call canon, a written code, a creed, an agreed belief in history. And later I'll talk a little bit about how many of the early Christian theologians tried to deal with the nature of history in the Jewish Bible. For example, the most obvious case is the story of Adam and Eve. Actually, to be accurate, I'd have to say the stories of Adam and Eve, since there are two. Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 contain two really quite different and distinct stories of Adam and Eve. And so the question becomes, how literal is that story? Or is it an allegory? Is the underlying truth more important than the actual events that are described? The early Christian theologians began to emphasize that the Jewish Bible was largely allegorical and that it did not describe history accurately. This was very controversial, of course, to many of the Jewish Christians of the time, since they wanted to believe literally in the text of the Jewish Bible. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then we have the final notion, the democratic notion, the notion of consensus, that we come to a belief through consensus. It's probably the most difficult. How do you reach orthodoxy in a democracy? And if you do ultimately allow a majority, or perhaps a supermajority, to decide that we shall all believe X, what do you do with the people who don't believe X? What are the rights of the minority? Consensus is perhaps one of the most difficult. And we have an example of it, which one of Raymond Brown's books has talked about. And I mentioned earlier the Jerusalem Council, where the decision was made that a good Christian did not have to first be a good Jew. A decision reached in connection with Paul and Barnabas visiting the Christian community in Jerusalem. Well, it appears that a clear majority of the Christians meeting in Jerusalem agreed with Paul. And Paul's letter and the Acts of the Apostles both convey that majority view. We now, however, have some fairly significant evidence that a large minority of the people at that group did not agree. And they didn't give up their belief that you had to be a good Jew to be a good Christian. And we now can look back and we can see that in several of Paul's letters, he talks about these, quote, troublesome Judaizers. And these were people who were basically coming to his communities and telling them that they weren't good Christians because they weren't good Jews. And he's referred to them, I believe it's 3 or 4 times in his letters. We also heard, and have been hearing for the last couple of weeks, selections from 50 years or more after his death, perhaps in the beginning of the 2nd century. But most biblical scholars today believe that the letter to the Hebrews is in fact the scripture of the minority dissenters in the Jerusalem Council, because it exaggerates the notion of the high priesthood, and it begins to describe the leaders of the Christian communities as priests, as high priests in some cases, who are responsible for sacrifice. And that is really quite a different notion from the notion we'll talk about, I think, next week, when we talk about how Paul dealt with the leaders of his communities. I'm going to open now to questions, and I will start next week with part Roman 2, which are the major themes in Judaism. I believe I've more or less covered most of the introductory materials, but I'm open to questions or comments. Yes.
What do you mean you now to generation? How many years is that?
Generation at that time would be between 20 and 24 years.
What was the question?
The question was, when I say 2 generations, what do I mean? A generation was typically gauged to be between 20 and 24 years at that time. Incidentally, there's a mistaken notion among many of us that people in that time period did not live long lives. That most people, if they reached 50 or 55, were considered to be wizened old elders of the community. Unfortunately, the statistics that are quoted do not take into account that there was significantly greater infant mortality in the early years, and as a consequence, the average age of people was drawn down by the infant mortality numbers. If you made it through the first year, your life expectancy was probably around 70 to 75. Thank you. I'll see you next week.
Thank you. I was trying to figure out where I'd find it. Did you want one too?